Abandoned for the wolves in the wild, the Apache woman was saved by a relentless cowboy. The cold wind cut through the trees like a sharp knife, making Aeon pull her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had been traveling with a small group from her Apache village for several days, and each step had grown more difficult than the last. The forest was dense, and snow had begun to cover the path, making it almost invisible. The howls of wolves echoed in the distance, a reminder that they were never far from danger. Yet she pushed forward, knowing that turning back was not an option. Survival depended on moving ahead, no matter how treacherous the journey became. Aeon's companions walked ahead, their shadows flickering in the pale light of the winter sun. She kept her pace, struggling to match their speed, but the cold had sapped her strength more quickly than she expected. Her legs ached, and her lungs burned as she tried to catch her breath. She glanced back at the trees she had passed, hoping she would see familiar signs of the land, but everything seemed foreign, frozen, and unforgiving. Every rustle of branches made her heart leap. She knew the wolves were near, but they were not her only concern. She had to worry about the humans too. At first, she had trusted them. They had smiled at her, shared small bits of food, and laughed at the cold as if it were nothing. But over the days, she had begun to sense something different. Their eyes had grown colder, their words sharper. She overheard murmurs when she wasn't looking, voices that hinted at frustration and impatience. "She's too slow," one man muttered once. Another added quietly, "She won't make it if we keep going at this pace." Aeon's stomach had tightened with unease, but she tried to dismiss it. She told herself that the forest was cruel, and humans often became selfish when survival was at stake. Still, the whispers followed her like shadows. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Aeon noticed a strange silence among her companions. The usual chatter had stopped, replaced by hurried footsteps and whispers she could not hear clearly. She struggled to keep up, her frozen fingers clutching at the straps of her pack. Then she tripped over a hidden root, falling hard into the snow. Pain shot through her ankle, sharp and biting. She tried to rise, but the cold and exhaustion made her falter. Before she could gather her strength, a voice called from behind her. "Keep moving, Aeon," one of them said. "We can't wait for you." There was no concern in the tone, only impatience. She looked up, expecting to see hands reaching to help her, but instead their faces were blank. They walked past her, leaving her alone in the growing darkness. "Wait," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please don't leave me." But the forest swallowed her words, and the sound of their footsteps faded. Aeon sat in the snow, her heart pounding, disbelief and fear mixing in her chest. How could they abandon her? She had trusted them, shared their fire, and helped gather food. Yet here she was, alone in the wilderness, with the wolves howling closer each minute. The sky darkened and the trees became tall, looming shadows around her. She could hear the distant crunch of paws on snow, the wolves moving silently, watching her. Panic surged, but she forced herself to breathe, reminding herself of the teachings her family had passed down. Her grandmother had always said, "The forest is alive and it watches. Respect it and it may guide you. Fear it and it may destroy you." Aeon clenched her fists in the snow and rose to her feet. She began moving slowly, carefully placing her steps, trying to make no sound. Every snap of a twig or rustle of snow beneath her boots made her flinch. Hunger gnawed at her belly and her ankle throbbed painfully, but she forced herself to focus. One step at a time. That was all she could do. As night fell, the forest became an entirely different world. Shadows danced in the moonlight, and the wind carried strange sounds that made her ears twitch. She found a small clearing and made a shallow pit in the snow, covering it with branches to create a place to rest. Her fingers shook as she gathered small sticks for a fire. Striking flint against rock, she managed to create a small flame. The warmth was brief but comforting, a fragile shield against the cold. She huddled close, wrapping her shawl tightly, trying to conserve what little strength she had. The wolves were patient hunters, and Aeon knew she could not stay in one place for long. She stayed awake for hours, watching the shadows, listening to the distant howls, and imagining what might happen if they approached too closely. Her mind wandered to her family, the village she had left behind, and the life she might never see again. Tears froze on her cheeks as she whispered promises to herself, to survive, to endure, and to see her people once more. By morning, her fire had died, leaving her with only the weak light of dawn. The cold had seeped into her bones, and the snow was crusted hard beneath her feet. She examined her ankle, which had swollen overnight. Every step was agony, but she forced herself to move. She remembered the small stream her grandmother had spoken of, a place not far from the old cliffs where water ran clear and fish sometimes gathered. Using her memory and the faint trail left by animals, she began the slow trek. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless. Wolves appeared as dark shapes in the distance, and Aeon learned to read their patterns, avoiding open areas and traveling when the wind masked her scent. She ate what little she could find, roots, bark, and frozen berries. The taste was bitter, but it sustained her. Hunger and fatigue became constant companions, yet she refused to give in to despair. Her spirit, though tested, remained unbroken. At one point, she reached a shallow river, its waters barely moving beneath sheets of ice. Aeon knelt to drink, the cold biting her hands, but she did not hesitate. The water revitalized her slightly, giving her enough energy to continue. She used rocks and fallen branches to aid her steps, creating a path that allowed her to move without falling repeatedly. Her senses sharpened. Every sound, every shadow, every movement in the forest was now a signal to survive or hide. Night fell again, darker and colder than before. The wolves howled closer this time, testing her resolve. Aeon pressed herself against the side of a hill, covering herself with a thin layer of branches. She remembered how her grandmother had taught her to breathe slowly, to calm her heart, and to become one with the forest. Though her body shivered, her mind focused. She would not become prey. She refused. She spent the night listening to the wind, the distant snaps of branches, and the low growls that carried across the snow. She thought about her companions, wondering why humans could be crueler than nature itself. Their betrayal stung more than the cold, more than hunger. It was the thought that some humans could abandon another in such a world that made her heart ache. Yet the fire inside her did not extinguish. Survival demanded courage, and she was determined to have both. Morning came with a weak gray light. Aeon stretched her stiff limbs and began moving again, guided by the small knowledge of the land that her family had given her. She noticed animal tracks, deer, rabbits, even wolves, and learned to read their stories in the snow. Every broken branch and displaced stone became a clue, a sign that survival was possible if she remained vigilant. Though exhaustion weighed her down, hope carried her forward. As the day wore on, her thoughts returned to her people, the Apache village she had left behind. She imagined returning, telling them her story and warning others about the dangers of trusting blindly. But for now, survival was her only goal. She would find water, food, and safety, or she would die trying. Each step was a testament to her strength and resilience, and each night survived was a victory over fear itself. By evening, she found a small cave partially hidden behind a thicket. It was not much, but it would offer shelter from the wolves and the biting wind. She crawled inside, laying down carefully to protect her swollen ankle. She collected fallen branches to keep herself insulated and prayed silently for the strength to continue. The forest was no longer just a place of fear. It had become a testing ground for her courage, patience, and intelligence. As she drifted into a restless sleep, Aeon dreamed not of rescue or comfort, but of survival. The forest, the wolves, the betrayal, everything had become part of her story, shaping her into someone who would endure against all odds. She did not know who would come for her or if anyone would, but she knew one truth. She would not give up, and she would not let the wilderness defeat her. Somewhere, deep inside, a fire burned, a fire that no cold, no hunger, and no betrayal could ever extinguish. Aeon woke to a thin ray of sunlight piercing the cave, the cold still biting her skin. Her ankle throbbed painfully, but the thought of staying in one place any longer was dangerous. The wolves were near, and she could hear the wind carrying their distant howls like warnings through the forest. She shifted carefully, testing her injured foot, and decided she could move slowly, step by step, as long as she was careful. She could not let fear paralyze her. She stepped out of the cave, and the forest greeted her like an enemy. The snow crunched under her feet, and every movement was a reminder of her vulnerability. Her eyes scanned for danger, for any sign of wolves or other predators. The trees, once welcoming in their quiet beauty, now seemed alive with watchful eyes. Aeon's mind was alert, her senses sharpened by the knowledge that every shadow could hide a threat. Hunger tugged at her stomach, and fatigue weighed on her body, but her determination to survive overpowered every doubt. She remembered the lessons her grandmother had taught her as a child, lessons about tracking animals, reading the wind, and understanding the signs of the forest. She crouched beside a small patch of earth where the snow had melted, revealing faint tracks of a deer. Carefully she followed them, keeping her distance and moving quietly. She knew that tracking prey was dangerous, but it was her only chance to find food. Hours passed, and the cold seeped into her bones, but she persevered, driven by the thought of life over death. At midday, she spotted a small stream partially hidden by bushes. The water was clear, moving swiftly beneath the ice, and she knelt to drink. The cold water revived her, giving her a brief surge of energy. She washed her face and hands, trying to feel a sense of normalcy in a world that had become chaotic and cruel. After drinking, she looked around for signs of food. A rabbit darted across the snow, its white fur blending with the landscape. Aeon held her breath, crouching low, and waited for the perfect moment. Her hands shook slightly as she aimed a makeshift spear, but the rabbit sensed her presence and bounded away. She sighed, frustration mingling with determination, realizing that the forest demanded patience above all else. Night fell, bringing a sharper cold and a louder chorus of wolf howls. Aeon made a small shelter beneath a fallen tree, covering herself with branches to protect from the wind. She wrapped her shawl around her as tightly as possible, shivering despite her efforts. The wolves were closer tonight, their growls echoing in the distance, reminding her that she was alone in a vast, dangerous world. She thought of the betrayal that had brought her here, of the people who had walked away, leaving her to face death alone. Anger bubbled inside her, but she turned it into fuel for survival. She would not allow their cruelty to dictate her fate. Sleep came in small, broken moments. Every rustle of branches, every distant howl jolted her awake. Her dreams were filled with running, with escaping predators, and with visions of her village. She saw her family, the people she loved, and the life she longed to return to. These dreams gave her strength, a reason to keep moving, and a reminder that giving up was not an option. Morning arrived with a weak, gray light filtering through the trees. Aeon tested her ankle again, wincing at the pain but knowing she had to keep moving. She spotted animal tracks leading through a narrow valley and decided to follow them, hoping they would lead to a safer place or potential food. She walked slowly, using rocks and branches to support her steps, her body aching with every movement. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, but she refused to lose hope. Each step was a victory, a proof of her resilience. By midday, she spotted a small deer trapped between rocks, struggling to free itself. Aeon's hunger surged at the sight, but she also felt compassion. She knew the forest was harsh, and life here was a constant battle for survival. Using a stick, she managed to guide the deer toward a less dangerous area, allowing it to escape. The moment gave her a strange sense of satisfaction, a reminder that survival did not require cruelty, that even in the wilderness, kindness could exist. She continued moving, her body screaming in protest, but her spirit refused to yield. The forest presented challenges at every turn, icy streams to cross, fallen trees to climb over, and snow-covered slopes to descend. Her knowledge of the land guided her, but experience taught her caution. She observed the patterns of the wind, listened to the distant calls of birds, and watched for the subtle signs that predators were near. Every moment was a test of her skill, patience, and courage. As the second night approached, Aeon's energy waned. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and her hands were numb from the cold. She found a small hollow beneath a rocky outcrop and decided it would be her shelter for the night. She gathered branches and leaves, creating a thin barrier between herself and the ground. Her ankle throbbed painfully, but she wrapped it carefully with strips of cloth torn from her shawl. She knew that if she did not protect herself, the cold and the wolves would overwhelm her. Sleep came reluctantly. She woke several times, hearing the wolves moving closer, their growls sharp and threatening. She whispered to herself, reminding herself that fear could not control her. She thought of the Apache teachings, the lessons about courage, patience, and respect for the land. Each thought was a shield against despair, each memory a source of strength. She would not surrender to the wilderness. The next morning she spotted a faint trail leading toward a distant ridge. The snow was thinner here, and patches of earth were visible. She carefully followed the trail, her senses alert. The wolves seemed to be less active in this area, perhaps deterred by the rocky terrain. Aeon's spirits lifted slightly. The ridge offered higher ground, a better view, and perhaps safety. She climbed slowly, using rocks and tree roots for support, feeling every muscle protest, but she refused to stop. By midday, she reached the top of the ridge and paused to rest. From this vantage point, she could see the forest stretching endlessly, the snow glinting in the weak sunlight. She felt a small sense of accomplishment. She had survived another day, navigated the dangers of the forest, and protected herself from predators. Her mind, though weary, remained sharp. She knew that the forest would not forgive carelessness, and she could not afford mistakes. She found a small patch of edible roots and some frozen berries, which she ate slowly, savoring each bite. Hunger still gnawed at her, but the small meal revived her enough to continue. She examined her surroundings, looking for signs of danger. The wolves were still in the distance, but for now they seemed distracted. She breathed deeply, feeling a brief moment of relief. Survival was never easy, but each small success gave her hope. As evening approached, Aeon began to build another shelter, this time in a small grove of trees. She arranged branches to block the wind and create a sense of protection. She covered herself with leaves and twigs, trying to conserve body heat. She closed her eyes for a short rest, knowing that even a brief sleep could restore some energy. Her dreams were quieter this time, filled with memories of her family and the life she longed to return to. During the night, the wolves' howls seemed farther away, and Aeon felt a small sense of safety. She stayed alert, listening for any unusual sounds, and adjusted her makeshift bedding to stay warmer. Her body ached, but she felt stronger than before. Each day of survival, each challenge overcome, had built a quiet strength within her. She realized that she was no longer the same person who had been abandoned. The wilderness had changed her, teaching her lessons that no village or companion could. The following morning, she rose with a renewed sense of purpose. Her ankle was still sore, but she had learned to compensate with careful steps and support from sticks. She knew she could not stay in one place for long. The forest demanded movement, vigilance, and courage. She began walking again, following a small stream that wound through the trees. The water promised life and guidance, and Aeon clung to the hope it represented. Hours passed as she navigated the forest. She found small signs of human presence, broken branches, faint footprints, discarded items, but they were old and unreliable. She realized that she was truly alone, and that survival depended entirely on her own skill and determination. Hunger and fatigue were constant companions, but she refused to give in. She remembered the promise she had whispered to herself in the cave: to survive, to endure, and to find a way back to life. By evening, she spotted a small clearing, where the snow had melted slightly, revealing a patch of grass and a few scattered shrubs. She paused to rest, feeling the warmth of the remaining sunlight on her face. It was a small comfort, a reminder that beauty could exist even in the harshest places. She found sticks and stones to build a fire, carefully striking flint against rock until a small flame flickered to life. The fire's warmth spread through her body, and she allowed herself a moment of relief. As she huddled close to the fire, Aeon reflected on her journey. The forest had tested her in ways she could not have imagined. She had faced hunger, cold, exhaustion, and the threat of predators, but she had also discovered a strength within herself that she had never known. The betrayal of her companions had cut deeply, but it had also ignited a fire in her, a determination to survive no matter the cost. Night fell once more, and Aeon watched the shadows stretch and twist around the clearing. The wolves were near, but she felt prepared this time. She had learned their patterns, understood their habits, and knew when to hide and when to move. The forest was still dangerous, but she had become a part of it in a way she never thought possible. She was no longer just a traveler. She was a survivor, attuned to every sound, every movement, every subtle sign of life and danger. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a brief rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. The forest was relentless, but so was she. Each day survived, each obstacle overcome, each night endured had made her stronger. Aeon's journey was far from over, but she had already proven that she could endure against all odds. The wilderness had become both her enemy and her teacher, shaping her into someone who would not be defeated, no matter what lay ahead. The cold morning air was sharp and clear, cutting through the trees with every breath. Aeon had spent another restless night in the forest, surviving the wolves, the snow, and her aching ankle. Her body was weary, but her spirit remained unbroken. She knew she could not stay in one place for long. The forest demanded movement, and her only chance of survival lay in continuing forward. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the landscape for a trail, any sign of hope. In a distant valley, a man rode slowly along a narrow path. His horse's hooves barely made a sound on the frozen ground, but the rider's eyes were sharp and alert. Luke was a cowboy who had spent most of his life in the wilderness. He knew the dangers of the forest, the movements of animals, and the signs of trouble long before it arrived. Today, he had been following signs of wolves, tracks, scat, broken branches, but he had noticed something unusual. Amid the wolf trails were faint, human footprints, uneven and desperate, leading deeper into the forest. His instincts told him that someone was in danger. Hours passed as Aeon moved carefully along a ridge. She had learned to read the signs of the land, the tracks of animals, the way snow had been disturbed, and the subtle traces of movement. She noticed that the wolves had begun to avoid a certain area, their howls farther away than usual. She paused, trying to understand why. She could feel a presence nearby, though she did not know if it was friend or foe. Her senses, honed by days of survival, told her to remain alert. Meanwhile, Luke dismounted his horse near a small stream. He crouched low, examining the tracks. They were fresh, human footprints mixed with deer tracks, and he realized that someone had been moving through the area alone. The prints were uneven, showing signs of pain and struggle. He frowned, a deep concern growing in his chest. Whoever it was had survived in this harsh forest for days, perhaps weeks, and yet the danger was far from over. Luke's mind worked quickly. He needed to find this person before the wolves did, or before hunger and injury took its toll. Aeon sensed movement from a distance and froze. Her heart raced as she tried to determine if it was a wolf or a human. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about strangers in the forest. Some were helpful, but others could be dangerous. She crouched low behind a snow-covered bush, trying to make herself invisible. Her body tensed, every muscle ready to react. She watched as a man approached on horseback, his eyes scanning the ground carefully. He moved cautiously, showing respect for the forest and its dangers. Luke noticed the small figure moving through the snow. At first he thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a fox, but then he saw the motion. A deliberate human step, slow and careful, injured but alive. His heart lifted slightly, knowing he had found someone, though he could not yet tell if they would trust him. He dismounted and approached slowly, making no sudden movements. "Hey," he called softly, trying to sound calm and friendly. "Are you hurt? Can you hear me?" Aeon froze at the sound of the voice. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, and yet she was too exhausted to move quickly. She did not know if this man was friend or foe. Her body shook, but she lifted her head slightly, peering at him from behind the bush. The man's eyes were calm, not threatening, and there was a sense of patience in the way he moved. Slowly, carefully, she decided to trust him, at least enough to reveal herself. Luke moved closer, keeping his hands visible and speaking gently. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I've been following the tracks through the forest. You've been alone for days, haven't you?" Aeon nodded slightly, too weak to speak. She could barely lift her hand to wave, but her eyes told the story of exhaustion, fear, and survival. Luke knelt down a few feet away, keeping his distance, giving her the space to feel safe. "Can you walk?" he asked, noticing the swelling around her ankle. Aeon shook her head, unable to hide the pain. Luke scanned the area quickly, then pulled a piece of rope from his pack. He fashioned a support splint for her ankle using a sturdy branch and soft cloth. "It won't be perfect," he said, "but it will help you move without making the injury worse." Aeon watched carefully, her heart filled with cautious hope. The forest had taught her to be wary, but she could feel that this man genuinely wanted to help. With Luke's support, Aeon took her first step since the morning, each one painful and slow. The forest seemed less threatening with someone beside her. She could hear the distant howls of wolves, but they felt farther away now, as if this man's presence had shifted the balance. Luke's knowledge of the land guided their path. He avoided open areas, moved quietly, and kept an eye on the distant tree line for signs of predators. Aeon followed, learning from his movements, her body gaining strength slowly. As they moved, Luke spoke softly, sharing knowledge about the forest. He taught Aeon how to read animal tracks, where to find safe water, and how to choose paths that would avoid danger. She listened carefully, her mind absorbing every detail. She felt a sense of relief for the first time in days. She realized that she had not only found a helper but someone who could guide her through the dangers that had tested her so severely. Night approached and they needed shelter. Luke led her to a small grove of trees, the snow softer beneath their feet. He gathered branches and leaves, helping Aeon build a makeshift shelter. The fire he started crackled to life, the warmth spreading through the clearing. Aeon watched the flames dance, feeling a small sense of comfort and safety. She wrapped herself in her shawl and leaned against the fire, grateful for his presence. The first night together was tense. Aeon could not sleep fully, her body still weak, her mind alert. She listened to Luke moving quietly, preparing additional firewood and checking the surroundings for danger. Though cautious, she began to feel a sense of trust forming. She realized that she did not have to face the forest alone anymore. The presence of another human, one who understood the wilderness, made a difference she could not ignore. The following days were a journey of careful movement and learning. Luke helped Aeon navigate the forest, avoiding wolves and other dangers. He taught her to conserve energy, to read the weather, and to use the forest to their advantage. Aeon, in turn, shared her knowledge of survival, the lessons passed down from her family, and the wisdom she had gained during her days alone. Together, they became a team, combining skill, courage, and determination. One afternoon, as they moved through a narrow valley, they spotted a wolf pack in the distance. The animals were alert, their eyes fixed on the forest floor as if sensing movement. Luke signaled Aeon to crouch and remain silent. They moved slowly along the ridge, avoiding the wolves' line of sight. Aeon's heart pounded, but she felt a strange calm, knowing she had someone beside her who could guide her safely through danger. By evening, the wolves were behind them and they found a safe place to rest. Over time, Aeon's body began to recover. Her ankle healed slowly and her strength returned. Each day, they covered more ground, navigating streams, rocky hills, and dense forests. The bond between them grew, not as companions of comfort, but as partners in survival. Trust was built not on words alone, but on shared experiences, mutual reliance, and the understanding that in the wilderness, one's life could depend entirely on another. One evening, sitting by the fire, Aeon looked at Luke and realized something profound. For the first time since being abandoned, she felt hope. The forest, once a place of fear and death, had become a landscape of learning and endurance. She still remembered the betrayal, still felt the sting of human cruelty, but now she had someone who respected her courage, someone who helped her survive when everything seemed lost. The forest continued to challenge them. They faced snowstorms that made travel nearly impossible, rivers swollen from melting ice, and wolves that lingered too close. Yet each obstacle was met with determination and teamwork. Aeon learned to anticipate danger, to move quietly, and to rely on Luke's guidance. Luke, in turn, respected Aeon's instincts and resilience, understanding that her survival skills were as crucial as his own. By the time they reached a high ridge overlooking the vast forest below, Aeon felt a quiet triumph. She had survived days alone, faced the wolves, and endured betrayal, exhaustion, and hunger. Now, with Luke beside her, she felt prepared for whatever the forest could throw at them. They shared a moment of silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of red and gold. The wilderness was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but they were ready. Together, they had become survivors. The cold wind bit at Aeon's face as she and Luke climbed the rocky ridge, the forest stretching endlessly beneath them. Days of travel together had strengthened both her body and her spirit. Her ankle was healed enough to walk without assistance, though she still moved carefully over ice and stones. Luke's presence had been a steady guide through the wilderness, and she had come to rely on his knowledge, while he had come to respect her courage, her instincts, and her determination. They paused at a small clearing, the snow glinting in the weak morning sun. Aeon bent down to examine faint tracks in the snow. Her heart leapt when she recognized the familiar paw prints of a wolf pack nearby. She froze, instincts on high alert. Wolves were dangerous, clever, and patient hunters. Luke crouched beside her, signaling her to remain calm. "They're close," he whispered, "but if we move carefully, we can avoid them." Aeon nodded, her body tense, every muscle ready to act. She had faced wolves before, but now she knew that danger in numbers was far greater than she could handle alone. They moved slowly through the trees, keeping low, following the wind's direction, and using every tree and bush as cover. Aeon's mind raced, thinking of the betrayal that had left her alone in the wilderness days before. She shivered, not from cold, but from the memory of fear, hunger, and isolation. Yet now she had a companion. Luke's presence was more than guidance. It was reassurance, a reminder that human kindness could exist even in the harshest conditions. By midday, they reached a small stream where the wolves had not yet crossed. They paused to drink and rest, their eyes constantly scanning for movement. Aeon noticed how much stronger she felt, how much more alert, and how her fear had changed into focus. She had learned patience, careful observation, and the importance of every small action in the forest. Each lesson she had learned alone became more useful with Luke by her side. Together, they were not just surviving, they were thriving. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the ridge above. Aeon and Luke froze, listening. The wolves had noticed them. Their presence had not gone completely undetected. Luke motioned for her to stay behind a cluster of rocks while he assessed the situation. He knew that confronting a wolf pack was dangerous, but retreating blindly could be worse. Aeon's heart pounded as she crouched low, clutching a stick for protection. She knew that their survival depended on calm thinking and careful movement. Luke signaled for her to move quietly behind him. Step by step, they advanced, staying low and using the terrain to their advantage. The wolves circled above, their eyes keen, ears twitching at every sound. Aeon could feel the tension, the thrill, and the danger coursing through her veins. She had survived alone against wolves before, but now she faced the pack with someone she could trust, and that trust gave her courage she had never known. The wolves approached the stream, growling and sniffing the air. Luke whispered to Aeon, "Stay calm, move with me." Together they crossed the stream, using rocks as cover. Aeon's mind worked quickly, recalling every lesson she had learned from her grandmother and every observation she had made during her days alone. She moved silently, carefully, and deliberately, avoiding branches that could snap and snow that could betray their position. As they reached the other side, a wolf lunged from the bushes, teeth bared, eyes glowing. Aeon froze for a split second, but Luke acted quickly, swinging a branch to scare it back. The wolf yelped and retreated, but the others were still watching. Aeon's pulse raced, but she steadied her breathing. She realized that survival depended on combining courage with intelligence, on understanding the forest and its creatures rather than simply running from them. Hours passed as they moved carefully through the rugged terrain, the wolves trailing in the distance but keeping their distance for now. Aeon's muscles ached, and her energy waned, but she refused to give in. She had come too far to surrender, and she had someone beside her who would not let her face danger alone. Luke shared small bits of food with her, dried meat, nuts, and berries he had found along the way. Each bite gave her strength, and each gesture reminded her that trust, once given, could be life-saving. As evening fell, they found a sheltered hollow near the base of a cliff. Luke built a fire while Aeon gathered branches for insulation. They huddled close to the flames, the warmth soothing their tired bodies. Aeon looked at Luke, realizing that the forest had taught her many lessons about fear, patience, and resilience. But the most important lesson was that human kindness and teamwork could be as vital as skill and strength. She had survived betrayal and isolation, but now she understood the value of trust and cooperation. The night passed with little disturbance. Wolves howled in the distance, but they did not approach the hollow. Aeon slept more soundly than she had in weeks, the exhaustion of survival finally catching up with her. She dreamed not of fear and isolation, but of hope, strength, and the bond she had formed with Luke. She realized that the forest, which had once seemed cruel and unforgiving, had become a place of transformation. She had emerged from it stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever challenges remained. The next morning, Aeon and Luke continued their journey, moving with purpose toward the edge of the wilderness. Luke taught her how to choose paths that would avoid predators, how to read subtle changes in the terrain, and how to conserve energy for the hardest stretches. Aeon followed closely, learning quickly and contributing her own knowledge from her days alone. Together, they formed a seamless partnership, each relying on the other, each respecting the skills and instincts of the other. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast valley. Aeon's eyes widened as she took in the view. The forest stretched endlessly below, but beyond it she could see signs of human habitation, farms, trails, and small clusters of buildings. Relief surged through her. They were close to safety, close to the world she had feared she might never see again. Her steps became lighter, her spirit lifted, and the forest no longer seemed as threatening as it had when she had first been abandoned. But the forest demanded one final test. A wolf pack appeared on the ridge below, larger than any they had faced before. The animals' eyes glinted in the sunlight, their teeth bared, muscles coiled for attack. Aeon's heart raced, but Luke remained calm. He whispered instructions, guiding her to use the rocks and trees for cover while he prepared to defend them. Adrenaline surged, but fear did not control her. She had survived too much to be paralyzed now. The wolves advanced, circling carefully. Aeon and Luke moved with precision, using every skill they had learned. Luke's knowledge of the terrain and Aeon's instinctive understanding of the animals combined seamlessly. A wolf lunged toward them, and Luke struck with a branch to drive it back. Another approached from the side, and Aeon threw a small stone, hitting its flank and startling it. The wolves paused, assessing the humans who had survived so far. Then, one by one, they retreated, deciding that this pair was not worth the risk. Aeon's body trembled, but she allowed herself a deep breath of relief. The forest was silent once more, except for the wind and the distant rustle of trees. Aeon and Luke looked at each other, understanding without words that they had survived the final test. Exhaustion mixed with triumph. They had faced the wilderness, the wolves, and their own fears, and they had prevailed. Aeon realized that the forest, though harsh, had taught her invaluable lessons. She had learned to endure, to trust wisely, to rely on her instincts, and to embrace the strength that came from both solitude and companionship. Over the next few days, they continued down the ridge, moving toward the signs of human life. Each step brought them closer to safety, but also gave Aeon time to reflect. She thought of her village, her family, and the betrayal that had started this journey. The pain of abandonment remained, but it no longer controlled her. She had survived, learned, and grown stronger. She had faced the worst the wilderness could offer and lived. Finally, they reached the edge of the forest. The sun glinted off fields and buildings in the distance. Aeon's heart lifted, and tears pricked her eyes. The wilderness, the wolves, and the dangers she had faced were behind her. She had endured, learned, and emerged stronger, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Luke rode beside her, a steady presence, sharing in the relief and triumph of survival. Aeon turned to Luke, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Luke nodded, a small smile forming. "You survived this. I only helped you get there. You have more courage than most people I've ever met." They rode the final stretch together, leaving the forest behind, each carrying the lessons of the wilderness, the memory of fear, and the triumph of survival. Aeon had been abandoned for the wolves, left to face a world that seemed cruel and unforgiving. Yet she had endured, survived, and grown stronger. With the help of a relentless cowboy who refused to leave her fate to chance, she had discovered not only the power of human kindness, but also the strength within herself. The wilderness had tested her in every way imaginable, but she had emerged victorious, carrying with her a deep respect for life, for the forest, and for the indomitable human spirit.